Welcome to the second episode in this mini-series about the history of Blackpool Pleasure Beach. In this episode we're going to look at Leonard Thompson, the second managing director of the park. And much like the first episode, we are going to cover all the attractions from his reign. We're going to look at any accidents that have happened, any adverts that I can find, any newspaper clippings, photos of all the rides, etc. So let's get into it. We start 1929 with an attraction that was known as the Cuddle Up. Now, it was later known as Crazy Daisy and eventually the Teacups, and effectively this was two discs of cars that spun round and switched, kind of in a figure of eight effectively. They slide between the two discs. It's a very similar mechanism to a rather bizarre ride that I was on a few weeks ago at Gulliver's World called the Hatchery. Odd little thing that was. Now, we also saw in 1929 Sir Hiram Maxim's flying machines had new gondolas put on, this time representing biplanes. And we got the first set of dodgems, which were known as Super Bowl. Now, 1930 saw only one addition, and it was quite an important one, and again, an attraction that sits in the park to this day, and that was the Ghost Train. Now, it started back then as a simple pretzel ride, and it was only on one layer. It was believed it was much further down towards where the Wild Mouse was, and then later it was moved up, extended to a second floor, and of course ultimately themed with the Ghost Train, and is known as the world's first Ghost Train. Now, if you want to know a lot more about the Ghost Train, there is an excellent video from Adventure Me with very detailed history specifically on this attraction, so I'll put a link to that one in the description down below. Now, 1931 saw the Outhwaites sell their share of the business, and at that point the park was fully owned by the Thompsons. We also got one new attraction in the form of boats. Now, I can't find specific, all I can see about this one is that it was a roundabout style attraction with boats. Now, I'm not old enough to have been there in 1931, but there is a picture of me on a boats roundabout ride in Beaver Creek 50 years later. So, well, probably more than 50 years, I was born in 81, 50 odd years later, so I believe that was the attraction, but I may be wrong on that one. It's, as I say, it's very difficult to get accurate details that far back, but another attraction. So 1932 saw the addition of Magic Mountain. Now, this was in the area that is currently occupied by Dora, whatever that's called, Dora's Boat Rides Adventures thing. So you boarded this train and you went through various scenes, kind of cartoon style. It's a little weird though, because the description outside: visit Mr. Funshine's building, Stonehenge, the Wizard's Kitchen, Penguin's Playground, at the bottom of the sea, and the depths of the equatorial Africa. Some of that wouldn't fly by today's standards. Now, 1933 saw the roller coaster, which is still there to this day as Nickelodeon Streak. It uses elements from the old Velvet coaster, namely the lift hill, and it is obviously it's still the same attraction as it was then, but the trains have changed. Interestingly, I believe this one didn't have restraints until as late as 2009, which is kind of crazy. I know it's not the most intense attraction, but yeah. Now, the other attraction that we got in 1933 that's still with us to this day is the Pleasure Beach Express. Now, the station that was there originally is no longer there. As you'll find out later on, there was an accident where that basically burnt down, and we've got the station that we have today. It's an interesting attraction. It used to go around the track the other way, and when I did the Walk the Woody experience last year, it apparently got switched around because of wear and tear on the track, but interestingly it doesn't need to switch again, which I find strange. I would have thought that was a every so many years switch it around. So if you are on that ride and you look backwards, some of the signage you don't see because you're going the wrong way around the track. It's got some kind of interesting animal stuff. I mean, it's in a really bad state at the moment. Again, I think it was last year, maybe the year before, they started to add some new audio out towards Big Blue, which kind of gave a lot of us some hope that they were actually going to do some stuff to it. Unfortunately, it is in a very sad state of disrepair right now. But the train itself has been diverted a few times, to make way for different attractions. It's moved around one of the pillars to get the big one in, it's moved around to get Infusion in, but ultimately it has remained on site, and it's still a great little attraction, especially after lunch. just jump on that for a casual 10-15 minute trip around the park. Now 1934 saw the addition of the Little Dipper, later known as the Zipper Dipper, and still on the park today as Blue Flyer. And obviously this is a kind of kids attraction, a small wooden coaster. The trains are definitely not adult friendly, you cannot fit 2 people in a seat. But you know, a small attraction and possibly some children's first experience of a roller coaster. Interestingly, nowadays obviously it goes through the former Space Invader building, but there is some photos, some aerial photos of this ride prior to that when it was fully in the outdoors. Now 1934 also saw a much beloved attraction in the form of the Fun House. Now obviously this was a kind of walk-through attraction where you could go on different elements. Probably wouldn't fly by health and safety standards if it still existed to this day, but as we all know, unfortunately it was burnt down many years later and is the site that is currently occupied by Valhalla. Now speaking of fires, actually 1934 saw the first fire on the park, but it was for the Pleasure Beach Express. I kind of alluded to that earlier, that the station burnt down. 2 of the trains in fact were damaged, but thankfully were restored and we got a brand new station that we use to this day. Now 1935 saw the addition of another attraction which again still exists to this day. Some say it's the best Woody in the country. I say those people need their head checked because it is rough as hell. And that is the Grand National. Now this is one of only a handful of Mobius coasters, Mobius loop coasters that were ever created. And by that it means that you leave the station on one side and you come back on the other. It is in fact a continuous track. It's not 2 tracks as it looks like. The clever bit is when you come out the station and turn around, you go from either being on the left to the right or the right to the left. So some people class that as 2 separate credits, some say you need to do a full track, both sides to make it a credit. Let me know in the comments below what you think. But this attraction it's now grade 2 listed, so the park can't get rid of it. I know there's many people that say RMC it, they can't. They're limited in what they can do. I actually don't think it could be RMC'd. I mean, I'm sure some people will say yes it can, and maybe it could, I don't know. I think they'd need to extend the footers and it's so close to the perimeter of the park, I don't think it could, if they were even allowed to. Now it's changed over the years with many different trains, again starting with versions that had no restraints, and there's some unfortunate stories about that one coming up. But yeah, I think it's particularly rough and the current trains don't do it any favours. Some say the previous trains were much more comfortable. I don't recall them, so I can't comment on that one, so let me know again if you preferred the other trains, if you actually think this is a comfortable ride, and if you enjoy it. When I was looking at the trains, I did find this Lego set of trains on Etsy, a bit like my Lego Hyperia back here. So if you like Lego and you like the Nash, then get yourself on Etsy. 2 other things about this ride. Andy Hines, who's the head of the Coaster Club in Great Britain, he was married on the ride in the early 90s, and there's another non-PG story coming up 2019 actually, so 2 episodes time. Yeah, this was used for something else. And actually another thing about the Grand National that some people will know, I'm sure, you know, most people watching this are probably enthusiasts, I'm sure many of you will know, but a lot of people don't, is that in the middle of the Grand National there's actually a garden. There's some greenhouses and they grow a lot of the plants to be used around the rest of the park. So most people are too busy trying to hold on for dear life as they go flying around that bone shaker of a ride. But yeah, if you do have a little look when you do that first drop and you kind of turn around, right in the middle, bunch of greenhouses. There's gardeners in there taking care of the site. Now interestingly, I found an article about Easter in 1935 and talking about how they were putting on 300 extra trains to help get people to Blackpool and how the roads would be used in double. Don't quite get that language, I'm not sure quite what they meant by that. Whether they just expected twice as many cars on the road, I'm not quite sure. But interestingly, it does talk about the Grand National because it was the new attraction, but it says that it goes up to 70 miles an hour. According to RCDB, it does 40 miles an hour, so either that was quite an exaggeration, or those early trains were significantly faster than the ones we have today. And the next attraction from 1935 actually stuck around in the park for quite some time, and that was the Turtle Chase. Now this was a simple tumblebug ride. It closed in 2004 and it was over by where Icon is now, and actually, if I'm not mistaken, some of those turtles still exist dotted around the park. Another one in 1935 was the Laughing Man. Now he's obviously still there to this day. He was inside the funhouse and he was one of the only things that survived that fire. He's now obviously situated over by Avalanche. Annoyingly, back then you had to put money in to make him go, and now he's just on permanently, which is a bit frustrating. He's had quite a few different outfits over the years, including one where he looked like Santa Claus. I found an interesting newspaper article from 1935 where both Leonard Thompson and Joseph Emberton helped set up another theme park in Belgium. Not their park, but they were consulting on the construction of this park based on the park that they had at Blackpool. So there's a little park in Belgium that's got a little bit of Blackpool inspiration. Now 1936 saw the addition of a Ferris wheel, and it was quite popular because 2 years later they added a second Ferris wheel beside it. You've probably seen the pictures, two kind of parallel Ferris wheels and, you know, what looks like a sort of clown character that's supposed to be kind of winding them around. Mr. Funshine, of course. And actually 1936 is the first time that Mr. Funshine makes his appearance, although some of those early logos look terrifying. And actually somebody commented on, when I put the thumbnails up as a kind of preview, somebody said it looked like something from The Shining. Because, yeah, terrifying. Obviously Mr. Funshine changed to a nice yellow colour and much more friendly, and he's come back in recent years. So, but yeah, started in 1936. Another thing we got in 1936 that is still there to this day was the ice parade. Now, obviously we now know that as hot ice, but this was the first time that an ice show was shown on the park. And, you know, a year or two later, they actually built a permanent ice dome, which is there again to this day. Obviously that is now handled by Amanda, and, you know, a lot of people believe that is her primary focus and that park's just kind of a sideline, as it were. I did find a number of old programs from various shows on eBay, which is kind of interesting to see. And I don't know if they still do this, but a couple of years ago they used to, I mean the show runs from about now actually, July-ish I think, right till the end of the year. I don't know if they still do this, but they used to have, I'm guessing it was technical rehearsals, but around about lunchtime you could go in and see half the show for free, and obviously you would pay to see the full show in the evening. So if that's still around, you know, it's worth considering a little lunchtime break and go in and see the ice show. Now I mentioned earlier that the Big Dipper kind of has changed a little bit over the years, and 1936 is when that kind of layout was modified. It's kind of interesting. I did find a POV from it, which is crazy to think that far back. It does look really, really strange without all the things we're used to seeing, like the big one in Infusion and the Big Blue Hotel. And yeah, there's also a member of staff just casually walking down the lift hill as the train goes up the lift hill. We got a couple of new additions in 1939. The first one was Dive Bomber. Now this is a rollerplane style ride built by US manufacturer, I can't even pronounce this, Airley Aircraft Company. Yeah, and then it was sold in 1971. And then we also got an octopus ride in 1939, which again stuck around for a little bit, made its way back onto the travelling circuit, and then was scrapped eventually. Now we got one new building and we lost another building at the same time. So 1939 saw the casino building that we all know and love, so the new version of it. That was created by Joseph Emberton. And at the same time, we saw well, not the removal of, there was a fire in the Indian temple. So obviously that building burnt down and had to be destroyed. But yet again, the next few years are quiet because we have World War II. What's interesting is the park survived mostly unscathed, and there's some stories going around that Hitler intentionally avoided the Pleasure Beach because he wanted to keep it as some downtime for his own soldiers. Over the years, the park has suffered quite a lot of fires. We've obviously mentioned a couple so far, and there was yet another one in 1949. This time it was the Ice Dome, and the fire destroyed large parts of the roof and dressing room facilities. In 1950 saw one addition to the park, and that was Moon Rocket, which, well, here's a picture of it. You've probably seen them before. And also the park had another incident. Now, in 1950, the dive bomber's two capsules collided, injuring 5 people. Again, as I've said already, safety standards were very, very different. Although I don't think this was a restraints issue, it just the structure itself gave way and the two cars collided. Fast forward to 1953, we've got yet another fire, this time on the Big Dipper. And it's interesting when you read the article because it happened on a tea break, sure, and whilst the fire was going and, you know, fire brigade were doing their thing, the rest of the park remained open and people were still enjoying all the neighbouring attractions, which, again, if that happened nowadays, I mean, the whole park would be sectioned off to let the firemen do their stuff, and then, you know, once everything's safe, they let you back in. So kind of crazy to think how much that's changed as well. It also says that they reckon it was like a couple of £100 worth of damage. No doubt that would be well into the thousands by today's standards if the same damage occurred. And the new attraction for 1953 was Sky Wheels. I'll put some footage in of this, but basically it's kind of like two mini Ferris wheels inside another Ferris wheel. Like there's two smaller ones that are rotating and then they're inside a frame that's going round. You'll see the footage, I've probably already shown you, but that was the new addition for 1953. There was only one attraction in 1955 that was added, and that was the Haunted Swing. Now, I guess in a way this was kind of the precursor to the Vekoma Madhouse that we all know and love these days. Think of Hex, etc. Obviously on a much smaller scale, tiny little carriage. And as far as I'm aware, this one, the carriage itself doesn't even move a little bit, where Vekoma Madhouse does, and it's just the room that rotates. Now, I think I alluded to this earlier, but when I was at the park a couple of weeks ago, that part of the attraction is closed off. So when you do Impossible, you get to the end and you go to the fire exit because you ain't getting on the Haunted Swing. So I'm curious to see if that is coming back. If you're enjoying this, and actually if you've got any memories of some of these rides, because, you know, the late sort of 60s, 70s, 80s, it's a bit more attainable than the first episode. I don't think anybody watching this is 125 years old. But if you've got any memories from this kind of era and these rides, I'd love to hear it down below. Also, any corrections. As I say, it's difficult to get stuff really accurate that far back. The closer we get to now, the more accurate things get. So if there's anything I've got quite just a little bit off, then please do correct me in the comments below. But let's keep going with the rest of this. Then 1956 saw yet another tragedy, unfortunately. This time it was a 14-year-old girl on the Grand National. Now again, as I've said numerous times already, there were no restraints back in those days, and when you read the newspaper article, they believe that the girl's skirt blew up. She took her hands off the train to put the skirt back down and was ejected from the train and ultimately went under that train and was crushed. Kind of crazy. Very, very sad. Then moving on to 1957, this is when the Ghost Train is completely rebuilt to basically what we know now. As I mentioned earlier, started a little bit further down that path. It was only on a single level, it wasn't themed, etc. So this is when it became the Ghost Train that we know and love to this day. In addition, in 1957, there was a freak gust, or hurricane effectively, that blew down one of those Ferris wheels, and thankfully nobody was injured at the time. In terms of new attractions in 1957, we got the Hurricane Jets. Now, I've had a few pictures of them, but I've also found some footage of a similar attraction elsewhere, so yeah, here's what they were. So moving on to 1958, and we got a very, very much loved attraction in the park, which unfortunately is no longer with us, and that of course is the Wild Mouse. Now this was definitely a custom Wild Mouse, and a wooden one, of which there aren't very many. Now it started off only on 2 levels, and then a few years later they added that extra level on top. And now it was quite a raucous ride. If you ever went on it, it was absolutely mental, and how that thing stayed on the track, I do not know. Now in 2017, there was some magnetic brakes added, which to many I think probably appeared to be, you know, looking after this ride for the future, but unfortunately those brakes didn't quite do what they were intended to do, and well, we all know the story now, but in the closed season of 2017, without any notice, the attraction was demolished, much to fans' demise. Now the park's kind of learned from this, in a way, in that this year we've had Grand Prix removed, and it was standing but not operating for the start of the season, and then they opened it for a farewell. Now granted, they charged 50 quid for that. Not convinced that was value for money, but at least they've learnt. you know, people want to say goodbye to attractions. Speaking of the Wild Mouse though, I did find a picture of John Wardley on it, which, you know, I'm sure many of you know, but he's synonymous with Alton Towers and rides like Nemesis and Galactica and various other attractions. So yeah, he kept popping into Blackpool for some inspiration. If you've read his books, you know this. Now 1959 saw yet another attraction that again is still with us to this day, thankfully, and that is the Derby Racer. I always go on this one when I go in the park. It's one of the first things you see, and it's a nice attraction. It features 56 different horses, and it's changed a little bit over the years. Now, the building itself that it's under used to be kind of transparent, at least sections of it were, so there was a lot more natural light coming in. That's all been blocked. But the horses used to move forwards and back as well as up and down. Now that mechanism was fairly problematic, and in a behind the scenes tour last year, the park basically said that that was disabled many years ago because, you know, it was a maintenance challenge. So at the moment they only go up and down, and the mechanism is still technically there, so there's a slim chance it could come back in the future, but if it poses challenges, I suspect they're never going to bring that one back. But yeah, that's why there's kind of large plates underneath the horses, so they used to, each row used to race as well as just going up and down. Now we've got quite a lot of things added in 1960, one of which I've just discussed a minute ago, and that of course was Grand Prix, although back then it was known as the Turnpike. It's important that we know that because there's another attraction in a few years' time called Grand Prix, and it ain't this Grand Prix, so the one you guys know as Grand Prix was called Turnpike. Now again, it's changed quite a bit over the years. First of all, it used to be petrol powered, and then latterly it became electric vehicles. The route has changed as well. Now I found old pictures of it with a very, very different track layout. This kind of weird logo, kind of looks like the command key on an Apple Mac in the middle there. And also I've seen pictures of the cars going the other way into the station. So at some point that track was the opposite way around to what it is today. Another new attraction that came in 1960 and hung around for a little while was the Cableway. Now, as the name suggests, it was the cable car that took you from one side of the park to the other. Tiny little gondolas, only held 2 people. And on the north end, at the entrance, well, that's now Loki's bar, and at the south end, that's the toilets. So that is where that used to go, and that used to be the mechanism to get from one side of the park to the other. Now, the other attractions that we got in 1960, one of them was a paratrooper ride, fairly standard, you'll have seen them elsewhere. Here's a picture of one. And the other attraction we got was a helicopter ride. Now that had helicopters on it, but it also had planes on it. I did find a picture of me as a little one looking very amused. And the last attraction from 1960 was Ellie's Garden Caterpillar, which was an odd little caterpillar thing that kind of went round and sort of bumped along as it went. I mean, I'm sure the kids loved it. Another thing we got from 1961 was the Alpine Rally. This was a little kids ride. It's got steering wheels in each seat. They don't do very much. This used to live in Beaver Creek and go through part of Space Invader, later on obviously. It now exists underneath Avalanche, although the last time I was there it was closed, so a bit like a lot of the other kids rides. Some of them are on like staggered openings, some of them only open for a couple hours, some of them seem to just be stand-up and operating. So I'm not sure what the future of this ride is, but well, again, here's a picture of me on it. Now moving on to 1962, we see yet another attraction that still is with us to this day and is also another fan favourite, and that is the Alice in Wonderland ride. Now, Leonard Thompson had quite a good relationship with Walt Disney, and so it is one of the few licensed Disney rides outside of a Disney park. Now there is a similar ride to this, conceptually at least, in California, although Disney budget, it'll be on a very different scale, but same kind of ride vehicles, effectively similar sort of concept. It's many of you have commented that on the POV that I've done, the audio is Willy Wonka. You know, we've got I've won a golden ticket. I'm not entirely sure what the connection between the two is, so if anybody knows, please do chuck that one in the comments. And well, yet again, Here's a picture of me, quite a bit younger than this one in fact. A little kid going around this in the early 80s. And unfortunately 62 saw yet another death within the park, and this time it was from roller coaster. Again, as I've said many times, no restraints. Person stood up, ejected from the ride. Also bizarre that with that particular ride having a death on it, that it did not get restraints until 2009. Found a few pictures of Ken Dodds on the park in 1964 for the big show of 64 at the Blackpool Opera House, but he visited the Pleasure Beach when he was there, and there's a few photos of him. Now moving on to 1965, we got a couple of new attractions, and one of them, although I can't find any footage of it in the park, is Ski Jump. Now this was a Mack Rides ride. I mean, I'll put some other footage in from a similar attraction and I'm sure you'll recognise it. The other thing that we got was Calypso. Now this is another ride that you probably will recognise, but it did have an incident where two girls were hospitalised. Interestingly, on that the newspaper clipping that I found about this, if you kind of scroll down a little bit, it mentions that house prices were £4,000. Even with inflation, that's only £82,000, so anyone know where you can buy a house that cheap these days? Yeah, the other thing that happened in 1965 was that Watson Road was covered. Now, to begin with, it was only partially covered, because prior to that, the Pleasure Beach was in two separate sections with road dividing it, and there was growing safety concerns, so, you know, a bridge was created across the park. As I say, initially just a small section, and of course now it is a full tunnel from one side of the park to the other, and that is of course the plaza outside of Wallace and Gromit. Now 1966 saw an attraction that many of you will remember and love, and that of course was the monorail. Now when it began, it was actually a transport system. It did have a couple of stations and it was designed to help you get around the park. They had 4 trains. There was one completely closed train, 2 partially closed trains, and 1 open train. Now, towards the end, when the attraction closed in 2012, it was just a non-stop scenic ride. It didn't actually have a transport feature in it. Didn't get you from one station to the other, etc. But as many of you know, despite the fact that the station has been removed, quite a lot of the track still exists. They've only cut a few portions of it away. And if you are interested, and you've got some space and some cash, there's still a few of the carriages available on their website. Now 1967 saw an attraction that many of you will miss. Certainly I do, and I wasn't particularly impressed with its replacement, and that was Drench Falls Log Flume. Now, many of you will know this one. It is, or was, in the site that is now occupied by Infusion, and an absolute headbanger of a ride. It was the world's longest log flume when it opened, and it was modified in 2000 to put a conveyor belt system into the station to make it a little easier to load and offload. Prior to that, the boats just bobbed around a little bit. But from this picture that I've seen, a bit similar to Valhalla, there's a giant pump hoover thing to hoover all the water out of the boats. So yeah, you got soaked on that one. Unfortunately, it was removed in 2007, as I said, to make way for Infusion. Bring back the log flume. So 1968 saw the introduction of the Monster. Now, you'll probably recognise this. It's where Ice Blast is right now, so that queue line was used. It was kind of like an octopus style ride, black, spinning around. There's, again, pictures of me on there as a little tot, and again, that was removed. Temporarily there was a twister put in its place, and then of course it became Ice Blast later on. 1969 saw the introduction of Astro Swirl. Now this was later known as the Millennium Bug. It's one of those kind of spinning rides where you stand on the walls and kind of get pinned to it as it kind of goes up. Now this was situated inside the dome that was opposite Grand Prix. Later that was removed and it became arcades, and of course now it is blocked off and I believe used for storage for the park. I can't be 100% sure on the exact year for this one, but somewhere around about 1970 we got the Alpine Golf. Now obviously today we have the Crazy Golf outside the park at the entrance, but this was a mini golf inside the park, and it was replaced by Avalanche, so it was in that kind of area. Now the other attraction we got in 1970 was Astroliner. It's kind of big rocket ship type thing, and it was a simulator ride, although it used VHS technology, which I'm sure many of you are old enough to remember VHS. Picture quality wasn't exactly the best, so maybe not the most realistic simulator going. The 71 saw another attraction that was much loved in the park, and that was the gold mine. Now, the ride system itself still remains in the park today. It's obviously been rethemed to Wallace and Gromit. Clearly back then it was a kind of old mine attraction. There's a few things that have changed though. It used to interact with others, so it's in the building alongside river caves, etc. It used to interact a lot, closer. There was a kind of cafe restaurant place that you could sit and the ride would go past, and that obviously doesn't exist anymore in Wallace and Gromit. I did find a picture of me sitting outside that attraction. God only knows what the hell I was doing, pulling stupid faces, but you know. Interestingly, there was a backstage tour last year on Wallace and Gromit, and there are still a few remnants of the ride inside. One of them, bizarrely, there's a Han Solo Carbonite kind of statue thing that was changed to Indiana Jones kinda-ish to fit, and it's still there on the wall, just with a curtain over it. So look out for that when you're on Wallace and Gromit.
And when we went to this to the Wallace and Gromit ride, they didn't remove it. So hidden behind this curtain is Han Solo with a Harrison Ford with a lamp mounted into his hand, some trousers mounted onto him. But effectively, you know, I don't remember Harrison Ford looking like Indiana Jones.
In 1973 saw a couple of attractions. The first one was Safari Bugs. Now this was basically just a roundabout themed around animals, later relocated to Lightwater Valley. The other one was Tom Sawyer's Raft Ride. Now this was an intimate attraction, very slow moving boats that kind of went around a guided track. Obviously that area is now where Icon is. An interesting thing from this year, 1973, was that the Big Dipper was subject to VAT because it was classed as transportation, public transportation should I say, and as such there was a 15p surcharge on every ride on the Big Dipper. In 1974 sees a couple of attractions. The first one was the Space Tower, big giant tower thing, observation deck that spun round. That was relocated to Morecambe and known as the Polo Tower. I think it actually had Polo branding on it. And then we also got Cyclone. Now Cyclone was a Pin-Farry Cyclone coaster. It was situated kind of near Revolution, sort of avalanche-ish area. Yeah, another steel coaster in the park. Now we round out Leonard Thompson's reign of the park on a bit of a sad note actually, and that is yet another fire, this time on the Big Dipper, damaging part of the station. So there you go, that is the second part of this series, and that is Leonard Thompson and his contribution to Pleasure Beach. Quite a busy guy, quite a lot of stuff happened in his reign. Next episode of course is Geoffrey Thompson, who many of you hold dear. Is the person that I think a lot of people think had the biggest influence on the park, probably because we all recognise him, but that is the next episode, so make sure that you like this one and subscribe to be told when that drops. And if it is already dropped, I'll put it up there. And if it's not already dropped, well there's the previous episode in case you've missed that. I've been Chris, you've been watching Coaster Dad. See you in the next one.